something happened in Washington that took some people's breath away and others' blood pressure jumped. Without loud fanfare or closed-door press conferences, Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky, who had recently been exchanging not-so-warm compliments, suddenly found a common language. So much so that the news spread like lightning across the planet, leaving both Kyiv and Europe in a slight stupor. But in Moscow, there was neither surprise nor confusion. There, in the Kremlin, they immediately realized that a completely different game was beginning, much more dangerous than everything that had come before. To be honest, no one expected such a move from the White House. Everyone was used to it. There were scandals in Congress, the Democrats were hysterical, military lobbyists were running around with reports and demanding billions more, and then bam, and suddenly the game was played by different rules. Trump, as a player with a good grip, used that very surprise that in politics is called a shock effect. One document and the whole situation is turned upside down. What does this mean for Ukraine? It looks like salvation. But if you dig deeper, it's a real trap. Europe, looking at what's happening, feels like an extra at this ball. They didn't invite us, they didn't ask us, they didn't even open the door. And Russia, well, everything is clear here. In Moscow, it suddenly became clear that this is no longer just diplomacy, but strategic betrayal. Not Kyiv, no. Betrayal of the old system of agreements. And the Kremlin is not going to let this pass. Zelensky entered Trump's office as an actor, rushing between frontline reports and angry video messages, and left as an unfree player. Trump literally dragged him into the center of a global deal that at first glance promises guarantees and support, but in fact turns Kyiv into an instrument, a pawn, a bargaining chip. The White House, as always, is putting on a performance. Only now on stage is not a theater, but a geopolitical drama, where the role of each character is written in advance. Trump did not rely on diplomacy, but on surprise. And it must be admitted that it worked like clockwork. In one move, he pulled Zelensky out of the West's slow aid and literally threw him into the epicenter of the new agreement, right there, where every point of the contract screams, old alliances are dead. Europe, what Europe? It remained in the corridor behind a closed door, and now there's panic. In Brussels they whisper, we were thrown out of the game. Germany and France, which until recently thundered with statements, suddenly found themselves pushed aside. Their voice is no longer heard, their opinion is not taken into account, their influence has disappeared. Everything they built was nullified in one evening, and not in Kyiv or Moscow, but in Washington. And Zelensky, who was driven into a corner both at the front and in his own society, sees this chance as a last life preserver. Not from a good life, not from force, but from hopelessness. This is not a victory, this is an act of survival. He agrees not because he won, but because he cannot do otherwise. And here's where the most interesting part begins. Moscow, the Kremlin. There, the reaction was instantaneous, because they know how to read between the lines and see what lies behind the beautiful formulations, and behind them lies one big cold combination, not just directed against Russia, but aimed straight at the heart of its strategy. The Kremlin does not believe in words about peace. The new format is not being conducted on paper with headlines. Russia knows very well what such a break smells like. This is not a pause, this is a regrouping, this is a breather, so that Kyiv, under American supervision, can rearm and gain strength. And no one in Moscow is going to put up with this. The fact that Trump signed at least something with Zelensky is already a challenge. After all, from this moment on, any step by Ukraine is automatically perceived as an action according to a scenario from Washington. They no longer see Kyiv as an independent player. They say directly, the Americans are at the helm, and if so, then the responsibility lies with them. This means that the confrontation is no longer with Kiev, but with the United States. That is the main intrigue. Brussels is silent. No, not because there is nothing to say. It is simply that there are no more words. All the statements, all the deep concerns and emergency summits now sound like empty bells. Europe, accustomed to playing the role of mediator, suddenly realized that it was left without a role. Not invited, not warned, simply crossed out of the equation. Paris and Berlin, those same European heavyweights that once dashingly launched the Normandy format, now look like guests late to a banquet. The Germans are still pretending to be in control of the situation, but this is already looking like theater. The French, they are completely lost. Macron with his verbose diplomacy turned out to be useless at a time when it was necessary to act, not to reason, and everyone understands this perfectly well, especially in Moscow. And in Moscow there is silence, cold, focused. Not because they do not know what to do, but because they know too well. Russia will no longer play by someone else's rules, especially those where everything is written in advance in the White House, and Moscow's role is simply to react. No, now only a game by its own terms, and the Kremlin has already begun to respond, not with words, but with steps. The first step is a complete revision of the diplomatic architecture. Visits are cancelled, negotiations are frozen, communication channels are reoriented. Moscow is now building a parallel system of relations not with Europe, which has lost its subjectivity, but with those who really influence. Beijing, Delhi, Tehran, Ankara. The world is moving into a phase of alliances without flags, temporary unions, targeted deals, strategic promises. This is no longer diplomacy, it is a game of survival. That is why what happened between Trump and Zelensky was perceived in the Kremlin not as diplomatic news, but as a call to action. The agreement between Washington and Kiev is not a peace agreement, it is a mobilization paper. A paper after which no Minsk logic will work. After all, when Trump signed this document, he seemed to say, "Now we are here, and all the rules of the old game can be thrown out." And here comes the main question that Moscow, Beijing and Ankara are asking themselves. What, in fact, will Russia do? Retreat, swallow, seek a compromise? No, Russia will outplay. But outplaying does not mean striking immediately. Russia knows how to wait, knows how to watch how the enemy comes out of the shadows, how he reveals his cards, where he sags, and where he overestimates his strength. The Kremlin understands that time is a resource. While the United States and Zelensky are rebuilding the architecture of support, while Europe is reflecting, and China is watching, Moscow has a window, a narrow but strategic one. And it will definitely enter this window not with tanks, but with combinations. And the combination is already being built. Activation has begun in the southern directions, Armenia, Syria, Libya, Central Asia, where it is possible to create points of tension for Washington and its allies. Not directly, but painfully, so that resources would have to be redeployed, so that the Ukrainian deal would start to crack not under fire, but under geopolitical pressure. This is a classic. To force the enemy to spend more than he expected, on nerves, on loyalty, on stability. And now let's go back to Kyiv. What's there? There is euphoria mixed with anxiety. On the one hand, signing something with the US is at least a picture of victory. Zelensky in the spotlight, a flag nearby, signatures on the table. Everything is beautiful. On the other hand, there is panic behind the scenes, because the military understands that paper is not armor and a contract is not air defense. And if tomorrow Moscow goes to a bank, no one will have time to react. Neither Biden, nor Trump, nor the EU. And most importantly, an alarming question arises within Ukraine itself. Who is ruling us now? If Washington dictates the terms, if supplies depend on decisions in the White House, if the course is determined not by Bankovi, but by Westveen, then where is the sovereignty, where is the choice, where is the right to one's own strategy? There are no answers, because they were not supposed to be. Trump, in his signature manner, seized the initiative. He is not saving Ukraine. He is using it as an element of his election campaign, as a trump card in trade with Europe, as a hook for Moscow. And here Zelensky found himself in the most unpleasant position. He has become an instrument, and not only against the Kremlin, but also against Brussels. They are beginning to fear him not only in Donetsk, but also in Paris, because now Kyiv is not a partner, it is an American project, and that means unpredictability, destabilization, pressure. The Kremlin does not make loud statements, does not rush with emergency briefings. Silence is the language of power, especially at a time when the enemy begins to celebrate too early. Moscow knows how to wait, but this is not passivity, this is concentration. The first answer is not in politics, but in geography. When Ukraine is in the spotlight, Russia switches its radar to the flanks. Transnistria, Abkhazia, Karabakh, Central Asia, where the fragile balance is based on personal agreements, not institutions. Where the temperature can be raised without turning on the official status of war. In Chisinau, they are again starting to whisper about a lightning-fast scenario. In Georgia, internal protests are suddenly intensifying, too synchronously to be an accident. In Armenia, there are statements about leaving the CSTO, which was previously considered unthinkable. These are destabilizing fields, pressure points. Moscow creates a background in which the West must react to too much and too quickly. The energy sector's next move is not at the level of turning off the valve, but more subtly. Moscow begins to redistribute flows bypassing Europe. The northern route through the Arctic, the southern route through Turkey and Iran. This is not just transport, these are alliances. This is the creation of energy unions outside the Western paradigm. Ankara, by the way, is catching the wave. Erdogan, as always, feels the wind. On the one hand, he is a NATO ally, on the other, a partner of the Kremlin, and on the third, a supplier of influence in Africa and the Caucasus. Turkey becomes a mediator, but on its own terms, which means it begins to dictate, not ask. And here, at this moment of strategic redistribution, Beijing appears. China is silent. But in this silence, hundreds of analytical reports, closed meetings and meetings at the Central Committee level in Beijing see that the West is again betting on confrontation. And if Russia becomes the next Iraq 2.0, then the next one will not be Moscow, but Shanghai. Therefore, China is doing what it knows how to integrate best without declarations. It is strengthening its economic presence in Central Asia, gaining a foothold in the Arctic through technology contracts, expanding the Belt and Road, offering Russia new logistics in exchange for loyalty. No high-profile agreements, only goods, credit and infrastructure. And all this outside the dollar. Meanwhile, a breakdown begins in Europe. For the first time in 2 decades, Germany feels that control is slipping away. France is losing influence in Africa, and this is hitting its position within the EU. Italy is balancing between American commitments and growing internal destabilization, and Hungary and Slovakia are already openly questioning NATO's agenda. In Brussels, they are starting to whisper, "What if America is simply using us?" It is at this moment that what the West calls an alarm signal appears. France and Germany are preparing secret contacts with Moscow, informal ones through business, through former diplomats, through channels that cannot be recorded in the report. This is not betrayal, it is an instinct. The instinct for survival. Zelensky, meanwhile, remains in the role of a flag that was placed on the map. Symbolic, bright, but helpless. Now he is no longer the head of state, but the coordinator of a military program, where all decisions are made in the Pentagon. Ukraine is no longer a subject, but a platform, and even Kyiv understands this. Moscow, without hesitation, launches the main part of the combination. Multi-vector drawing of the United States into an overloaded conflict contour. Everything is like in chess. Distraction on the flanks, overexertion of partners, threat of symmetrical strikes, and then an offer of peace, but on different terms, on terms that were previously unthinkable. If you are ready, in Part 4 you can show how the US itself is starting to lose the initiative, how chaos is growing in the NATO allied system, and how the world, tired of conflicts, is starting to demand a new Yalta format, but with other players at the table. Washington feels an unusual dominance and an over-expenditure of influence resources. Until recently, it seemed that strategic control over Eurasia is a matter of technique. Sanctions, military aid, isolation of Moscow, containment of Beijing, everything like in textbooks. But the textbooks were written for one hegemony, and on the board there is a different geometry. America is suddenly faced with a paradox. The more it interferes, the weaker the result becomes. Ukraine. The aid continues. Deliveries are coming, but not as before. Congress is holding up budgets, the voter is tired, the front is at a standstill, and most importantly, it is impossible to explain why the victory is needed, where it is, what it is, who will decide that the victory has been achieved. Meanwhile, hostility toward the foreign agenda is growing in the United States. Millions of Americans are asking, why are we paying for someone else's war again when we have our own? And this is not just grumbling, it is an electoral signal. And any candidate who ignores it becomes vulnerable. Taiwan. The next front line, perhaps, but after Ukraine, few in the United States are ready for an open war with China. The Pentagon believes that economically this is a different level of risk. And what is more important, the Allies are not ready. Neither Europe, nor South Korea, nor even Japan want a complete break with Beijing. And now the most dangerous thing, a breakdown in trust within the alliance. NATO is starting to lose its meaning not in form, but in content. Turkey is playing three ways. Hungary is blocking the solution. France is torn between anti-Americanism and the need to look like a leader. Germany is trying to balance, but internally there is an industrial crisis and a demographic breakdown. Poland is aggressive, but it cannot pull the eastern flank alone. And at this point, the small countries start to panic. Promises are no longer enough for the Baltics. They demand physical presence. Finland and Sweden suddenly understand that joining NATO is not a guarantee, but an obligation, and without the right to refuse. And what does the rest of the world do? They watch and draw conclusions. India is strengthening its course on strategic autonomy. Saudi Arabia is bargaining with China and ceasing to be a vassal of the dollar. Latin America is slowly but surely moving away from Washington. Africa refuses to submit to the old logic of aid for loyalty. Even Australia and Canada are beginning to feel that we are not the center, we are tools. And here a new front line is emerging, not physical, but conceptual. The world demands new rules, a new balance, a new format. No one believes in a rules-based order anymore, if these rules are written in one office. The first proposals for a new international conference are being made, something like Yalta, but without a messiah, without winners, without a dictate. Moscow, Beijing, Ankara, New Delhi, even Riyadh, everyone is ready to discuss. But the US can't yet. The illusion of monopoly is too fresh. At this moment, a phrase that will go down in textbooks is heard in the corridors of the G20. Order ends not when it is violated, but when people stop believing in it. If you want, you can move on to the final part, which describes the reversal of the world architecture, the emergence of a new block of influence, the hybrid geopolitics of the future and Russia's role in a system where there is no longer a center. 2020 began as a battle for leadership, but closer to the middle of the decade it became clear that leadership as such no longer exists. The world did not become multipolar, as expected, it became multi-core. This is more important and more difficult. Multipolarity is a competition of capitals. Multi-core is the emergence of several centers of gravity, each of which not only influences, but forms its own system of attraction: monetary, technological, political, civilizational. We are entering an era of weak alliances, but strong ties. Everyone against everyone. No, everyone is with everyone, but not completely. Trust deficit, pragmatism currency. Russia and China are no longer just strategic partners. These are two cores of anti-Western autonomy, acting not as an alliance, but as moving platforms that can be stood on, but cannot be controlled from the outside. India is separate. It does not join anyone, but everyone is keeping an eye on it. It is becoming a new Switzerland for the East, neutral, but necessary. Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia. Each is building a regional orbit, competing with each other, but no longer looking back at Washington. Europe is slowly turning into a geo-economic periphery, which lacks subjectivity, but has enough resources to stay on the map. The main conflict is between the elites and reality. Russia in this world is not an alternative, but a constant. After the exhausting period of 2014 to 2024, Russia has learned to live not against someone, but according to its own logic. Instead of integrating into the West, the perimeter of stability. Instead of exporting ideology, exporting strategic reliability. Instead of competing with the US, the new role of an architect of autonomous zones. Putin's Russia is not a role model, but a model for understanding how to survive while maintaining integrity in an era of geopolitical collapses. Yes, it is authoritarian, yes, it is tough, but it is effective in coordinates where others simply cannot survive. The world is no longer looking for an ideal form of government. The world is looking for a working form of sustainability. And Russia is one of the benchmarks. Values are leaving, configurations remain. Terms like democracy versus autocracy no longer work, because China is working and France is cracking. International law, because it is no longer applied evenly. Human rights, because their interpretation has become a tool of pressure, not morality. Instead, there are functional alliances of interests, temporary formats of trust. Corridors of influence instead of zones of control. Bottom line, the world has not collapsed, it has crumbled into fragments, and each fragment is now looking not for a dominant leader, but for an assembly point. Russia is one of the few countries that can give such a point not ideologically, but structurally. The future is not a new order, it is a refusal of the united. And in this refusal is a new freedom for the strong.